Hello everyone. So, today we are going to talk about the second part of the topic, which is about body fluids and circulation. So, to begin with, let us talk about what are circulatory pathways. So, by circulatory pathways, we mean a system which is used for circulation of blood throughout your body of the organism. So, there are two kinds of circulation that are present: open circulation and closed circulation. So, the open circulation, as you can see, is mostly present in organisms such as arthropods and mollusks, which are invertebrates. But the closed system is the system which is present in organisms such as birds and mammals. Now, let us see what are the differences between the open form of circulation and the closed form of circulation. So, in the open form of circulation, what you have is you have a heart which pumps out blood through blood vessels, which are like pipes carrying the blood. And however, since these blood vessels are carrying blood, they are open ended. So, the blood is delivered out into empty spaces called sinuses, which are there in between the tissues of that organism. So, the blood fills up these sinuses, and then there is exchange of nutrients and gases that can take place between the blood in the sinuses and the cells of the tissues in the organism. What about the closed system of circulation? Here there is a heart as well, and it sends out the blood through the vasculature, which is closed ended, it is not open ended. So, this vasculature will form a lot of branches, which will kind of look like this, and these branches will form even finer branches, which kind of form a network together. So, these network of what is known as capillaries are in close proximity to the tissues and the cells within the tissues of this organism. But this is not an open ended circulation. So, although the exchange of gases can take place in this manner, the oxygen as well as the nutrients present in blood can diffuse out of these capillaries and can be taken up by the surrounding tissues. Now, after this process has taken place, the rest of the blood, which is having the waste products as well as the carbon dioxide that is released by these cells, is carried back to the circulatory system, to the heart. So, the main difference thus between the open and the closed system is that the blood vessels in the open system are open ended, blood flows out into the sinuses. In case of the closed system, there are no open ended blood vessels, but the blood flows through a closed network of blood vessels, and the gases and the nutrients that are present in the blood have to diffuse across the wall of these blood vessels into the surrounding tissues. So, this is the description of what I just told you, that the blood pumped by the heart passes through large blood vessels into open spaces or sinuses, and in case of the birds and the mammals, the blood pumped by the heart is always circulated through closed blood vessels. The advantage of the closed pathway is that it is easier to regulate the blood flow or the fluid flow more precisely through this mechanism. Now, let us look at the vertebrate system, because we are going to talk today about human circulation. So, humans are vertebrates, but let us compare the human circulatory system to the circulatory system present in other organisms, other vertebrates. So, all vertebrates possess a muscular chambered heart, meaning there are partitions within the heart. So, there are different chambers within the heart, but across the species there are differences. So, let us start first with the fishes. The fishes have a minimalistic heart which consists of only two chambers. It has one atrium and one ventricle. The atrium and ventricle term I am going to explain later on during the lecture. So, what is the circulatory system like in these fishes? So, the heart pumps out deoxygenated blood, and this is oxygenated by the gills and supplied to the rest of the body, and the deoxygenated blood is then returned to the heart, and this is called single circulation. The importance of this term single circulation will become apparent when I talk about it in the rest of the lecture. So, what does this whole system look like? Let me draw it and show it to you. So, if you consider this to be the heart, So, this is the atrium and this is the ventricle. Now, the blood vessels coming out of the ventricle will pump the blood to a system of blood capillaries which are passing through the tissue where gaseous exchange can take place. So, oxygen is taken up in the blood in tissues such as the lungs or the skin or the gills. In case of the fishes, it is the gills. So, it goes to the gills and here there is exchange of gases, oxygen gets into the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood into the water. So, here the oxygenated blood will then go to the rest of the tissues and again through a system of capillaries where it will again undergo exchange of gases. And what will happen is here the oxygen will flow out into the tissues and the carbon dioxide will be taken up from the tissues into the blood and now the blood is deoxygenated. This is oxygenated blood. So, what about the amphibians and the reptiles? All of the amphibians and all of the reptiles except crocodiles have a different system. So, they have a 3-chambered heart. So far we have looked at a simple system which is in case of the fishes where there is only a 2-chambered heart. In case of amphibians there are 2 atria and 1 ventricle, and what happens here is that the left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the gills, lungs or the skin. So, this is the system and what it looks like. So, these are the 2 atria. So, this is the right atrium and this is the left atrium. Now, this one is receiving blood from the tissues where oxygenation is happening, which can be the lungs or the skin or the gills. Now, this is coming from another place. So, now if I draw the ventricle is like this and this is, there is a continuation between the left and the right side of the ventricle. So, the blood on either side is mixed. Now, this blood coming out of the ventricles first goes to the lungs or the skin to get oxygenated, and then oxygenated blood comes back into the left atrium and then from that it flows into the ventricle. So, here in the right atrium on the other hand, blood from the systemic circulation, that is deoxygenated, is coming. So, here also there is a system of capillaries where gaseous exchange is taking place and this is connected to the same vessel that is coming out of the ventricles, which is supplying the mixed blood. So, the blood here in the ventricle is coming both from the deoxygenated blood from the system as well as the oxygenated blood from the lungs are getting mixed here, and the mixed blood is going out partially to be oxygenated again and partially into the systemic circulation to the tissues to supply the oxygen to these cells. So, this is kind of called incomplete double circulation, because there is a mixing of blood between the oxygenated and the deoxygenated blood here. Now, let us look at what the birds and mammals, and remember the crocodiles were the only exception among the reptiles, which have this kind of a system where you have a 4-chambered heart. So, you have 2 atria and 2 ventricles, and this is a system which is known as complete double circulation, where the part of the oxygenated blood is completely separated out from the deoxygenated blood, and you can see that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood are received by the left and the right atria respectively, and this then passes on to the 2 ventricles on the same side. Then the ventricles pump it without any mixing up into two pathways that are separate, two circulatory pathways. One goes into the lungs to get oxygenated and the other goes to the systemic circulation, which is oxygenated blood. So, if I draw the heart there, it looks like this. This is the part that is going into the systemic circulation, and this is originating from the left ventricle. So, here the left ventricle is completely separated from the right ventricle, and the left atria and the right atria are also completely separated. So, you see here this is the left atrium. Now, this oxygenated blood is coming here in the left ventricle, but where is it coming from? It is coming from the left atrium. And where is it coming into the left atrium from? It is coming in from the lungs. So, here is the pathway which goes to the lungs, and the capillaries here exchange the gases. So, oxygen is taken up and carbon dioxide is given out. So, the deoxygenated blood which was coming out from the right ventricle goes to the lungs and it gets oxygenated, goes back into the left atrium and then to the left ventricle. Through the left ventricle, the oxygenated blood goes out into the systemic circulation. Here the exchange of gases takes place in the opposite manner. Oxygen comes out and carbon dioxide goes in, and then the deoxygenated blood is returned back into the right atrium. From there, it passes on to the right ventricle and again goes out towards the lung to get oxygenated. So, this is the entire circulatory system that is present in the birds, mammals and crocodiles, and this is a 4-chambered heart. Now that we have an idea about the different kinds of circulatory systems that are present in all the vertebrate species, let us focus on the circulatory system and the heart of human beings. So, human circulation. So, human circulation has certain characteristics. It is also known as the blood vascular system. It has a muscular chambered heart which is present in all vertebrates, and it has a closed branched blood vessel system to carry the blood, which as you see is also common to all vertebrates. And what is the medium that carries the oxygen and the carbon dioxide and the other nutrients? That is of course blood, and this blood we have talked about in great details in the previous lecture, that was part 1 of this topic. Now, we are going to first focus on the human heart and learn about how it functions, what are its different parts and how it is optimized to carry out the process of circulation. Now, where is it located? So, this is a schematic of the thoracic cavity of the human body. Thoracic cavity lies inside the chest and it is enclosed by the ribs. So, in the thoracic cavity you have the lungs which are present, 2 of them on either side, and between them actually lies the heart. So, the heart is actually a mesodermally derived organ. What do we mean by mesodermally derived organ? In the developing embryo, there are 3 kinds of tissues. So, the tissues that are first formed are called the 3 germ layers. They are called the ectoderm, the mesoderm and the endoderm. So, the ectoderm will later give rise to 2 primary kinds of tissues, the skin and the nervous system. And the mesoderm gives rise to all kinds of connective tissue present in the body, which includes the skeletal system, the blood, the connective tissue, the ligaments, the tendons, several organs including the heart. So, that is why the heart is known as mesodermally derived organ. And the third germ layer is the endoderm, which primarily gives rise to the gut, which we will not talk about today. So, what is the characteristic of the heart? It is present in the thoracic cavity, it is present between the 2 lungs and it is slightly tilted to the left. You might have heard some people ask you to listen to your own heartbeat, and if you place your hand on your chest, if you move towards the left side, you can hear the heartbeat coming from there. So, the reason the heartbeat comes from the left part of the chest is because the heart is slightly tilted towards the left. And what is the size of the heart? It is the size of about a clenched fist. Now that we know where the human heart is located, let us look inside. So, this is a diagram that shows you the heart. It is a cartoon representing the human heart, where you have cut the heart open in the longitudinal plane. Okay. So, now what are the characteristics of the various parts of the heart? So, before I get into the heart itself, let me tell you that the entire heart is actually covered by a membrane, a bag, a double walled membrane, which is called as the pericardium. Now, this also has a fluid inside it, which is called the pericardial fluid, and that serves as a protective function to protect the heart from any external trauma. Now, as you know very well, I have explained to you already that there are 4 chambers in the human heart, 2 atria and 2 ventricles. Now, let me again draw a schematic of the heart to show you and explain to you how the blood flows into the heart in the human. So, this is the right atrium, and it has 2 channels for blood to come in, which are called the vena cavas. This is called the superior vena cava, and this is called the inferior vena cava. These are the 2 big veins which bring deoxygenated blood into the heart, and this is the right atrium. Now, there is a gap between the right atrium and a connectivity between the right atrium and the lower chamber, which is called as the right ventricle. On the other side, we have the left ventricle and we have the left atrium. Now, the left atrium also has some blood vessels that bring blood to it, and these are called together the pulmonary veins. Now, this brings in oxygenated blood into the heart. This is the left atrium. Now, what is the outflow system in the heart? So, inflow into the right atrium, as I just told you, the superior and inferior vena cavas. Then we have inflow into the left atrium, which are the pulmonary veins, which I also showed you. Then we have outflow from the right ventricle. So, here you have a large vessel which is called as the pulmonary artery, and here deoxygenated blood is going out of the heart to the lungs to get oxygenated, and then oxygenated blood is returning from the lungs through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. From the left atrium, this blood goes into the left ventricle, and again there is an outflow tract going out from the left ventricle, which is called the aorta. This is carrying oxygenated blood, and this oxygenated blood is going to the entire body to supply all the tissues with oxygenated blood. So, this is the outflow from the left ventricle, which is called as the aorta. Now, there are other structures that are there within the heart. Let me explain to you. There are the 2 atria. So, between the atria there is a chamber, there is a partition which is called as the interatrial septum. Okay. Then between the ventricles there is also a separating membrane which is called as the interventricular septum. The interatrial septum is here. Then other than this, although there is connectivity between the atria and the ventricles on the same side, the rest of the area around that connectivity is also bound by a septum, which is called as the atrioventricular septum, and this is present here. So, now we have a good idea about what the 4-chambered heart of humans looks like and where the oxygenated blood is coming in, how it is leaving the heart and going to the lungs to get oxygenated, and then from where it is coming back into the heart and to be pumped out again of the heart and to reach the entire body to deliver this oxygen to the tissues. And then what happens in the very end is that after the tissues have received the oxygen, they release carbon dioxide, and this deoxygenated blood will then come back into the atrium on the right side through the vena cavas to get oxygenated once again. So, there are two other important structures that are present in the heart, which are known as the heart valves. So, I will explain to you what the heart valves are now. So, valves, as you know, are usually openings that allow the flow of fluid only in a single direction, and that is the same purpose that these heart valves serve. They do not allow blood to flow in two different directions. So, once the blood has gone through the valve, it cannot go back up again. So, where are these valves located? So, there are two valves which are located between the atria and the ventricle. They are known as the atrioventricular valves, and their names are tricuspid and bicuspid valves. So, first we will talk about the tricuspid valve. So, the tricuspid valve is located between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and if I draw it, it will look something like this. If you look at it from the top, it has 3 flaps, and if I look at it from the side, this is the right atrium and this is the right ventricle. So, the flaps are like this and they can allow blood to go only in this direction, meaning blood can never go back in the opposite direction from the ventricle to the atrium. That is not allowed, right. What about the bicuspid valve? So, on the other side of the heart, similarly, you have on the left side, you have the bicuspid valve, which lies between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And it is called bicuspid because it has only 2 leaflets which open up and it looks like this. So, here also the blood is only allowed to go in this direction from the left atrium into the left ventricle and never backwards. That is not allowed. So, we have now looked at the bicuspid valve, which is also known as the mitral valve between the left atrium and the ventricle. Now, there are another set of valves which are called as the semilunar valves. So, where are the semilunar valves located? The semilunar valves are located in between the ventricle and the outflow tracts from the ventricle. So, if you remember, this was the right ventricle and this was the left ventricle. So, the outflow tract from the right ventricle is the pulmonary artery and that from the left ventricle is the aorta, right. So, at the mouth of these two large blood vessels lie the semilunar valves. So, they are called as the pulmonary valve as well as the aortic valve respectively. Now, let us look at the phenomena by which the heart actually functions. This is called the rhythmical excitation of the heart. So, how does it happen that ever since the heart is taken shape while you are still a fetus inside your mother, the heart is formed and it starts to beat, and once it starts to beat, it continues to beat throughout the life of an individual. The reason for this is because the heart is made up of muscular tissue. Now, this kind of muscular tissue is very special. It is called cardiac muscle and it has some very unique properties. So, in our body, there are only 2 kinds of tissues that can be electrically active, that is, they can conduct electricity. What are these tissues? They are nervous tissue, which make up the nerves, and the muscular tissue, which make up the muscles. So, the nerves actually communicate to the muscles through this electrical activity. Now, the muscle itself also has inherent electrical properties, and this includes the cardiac muscle. Now, the cardiac muscle is special because it does not need any external stimulation from the nerves in order to have this electrical property. It can initiate the electrical property on its own. And where is this specific tissue located? It is within the heart muscle itself, and this generates what is known as an action potential. So, there are special regions of the cardiac muscle which are known as nodes. These are specialized to be electrically active on their own, and they generate action potentials at a certain rate, which sets up the beating of the heart, as you will see in the subsequent part of this lecture. So, what are these specialized regions in the heart? There are a number of them. So, the principal one is called the sinoatrial node. And where is it located? It is located here in the right upper corner of the right atrium. This is cardiac muscle tissue, but it does not have a lot of muscle actin and myosin fibers which are used to contract the muscle. Rather, it is a tissue which has a lot of fibers that are not having any actin or myosin. So, they do not contract, but they can be electrically activated. So, they can conduct electricity. So, they act like wires. Now, the other tissue which is also another node is called the atrioventricular node, and this atrioventricular node is also present in the atrium, but it is present in the lower left corner of the right atrium, and it is almost at the border between the atrium and the ventricle. So, it is close to the atrioventricular septum. Now, there is a pathway of fibers that connect between the two, between the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node. So, the electrical activity or the action potential that is generated in the sinoatrial node is actually conducted all the way up to the AV node, although with a slight delay. Now, this AV node, again there is a set of fibers that emerge out of the AV node, which is known as the bundle of His, so or AV bundle. So, this AV bundle goes through the ventricular septum. Remember that membrane that was separating out the two ventricles. So, this bundle of fibers that is coming out from the AV node goes into it and then branches into two branches, the left and the right branch, which then go to either of the two ventricles, the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and they form many more branches here, and they cover the entire surface of the two ventricles. So, the electrical activity which originated in the SA node will now go to the AV node. From there it will go through the AV bundle, and then after the AV bundle it actually divides into two, and then it goes as the bundle of His to the two other structures which are known as the Purkinje fibers. So, this is called as the bundle of His, this structure here, and it divides into two branches, as I told you, on the left and the right sides, and these are called as the Purkinje fibers, which will then cover the entire ventricular surface of the heart. Now, let us talk about the specific properties of these. So, the nodal tissue, as I told you, is auto-excitable. This is very important, because as I told you, the heart muscle, once it is formed, it starts to beat and it never ceases to beat until the death of the organism. So, and this heart tissue does not need any external stimulus in order to actually start beating. So, this is auto-excitable. What is the SA node known as? The SA node is known as the pacemaker of the body, because it sets the pace of the heartbeat. And what is the space? The space is about 70 to 75 action potentials which are fired every minute, and each action potential corresponds to one beat or one contraction of the heart muscle. Therefore, on an average our heart beats about 72 beats in a minute. This can vary according to different conditions, but this is an average value which is about 72 beats a minute. Now, let us look at the functioning of the heart. So far I have told you that the heart has certain chambers, it has certain blood vessels connected to it, and it has heart valves which allow the blood to flow in a certain direction and not in other directions. Then it has this conduction system which conducts electrical waves throughout the musculature of the heart, throughout the atria and throughout the ventricles. And how does this all coordinate together, resulting in the performance of the function of the heart, which is the pumping of blood out towards the lungs as well as towards the systemic circulation. Now, let us see that. So, if you want to study how the heart works, we have to study what is known as the cardiac cycle. So, this cardiac cycle has multiple stages. So, we will look at each of these stages one at a time. So, before I explain to you what the cardiac cycle is, I want to talk about two different terms. One is called as the systole and the other is called as the diastole. The systole usually refers to the contracting phase of the heart muscle and the diastole usually refers to the relaxing phase of the heart muscle. So, the first stage that we will talk about is called as the joint diastole. It is called as a joint diastole because at this stage both the atria and the ventricles in the heart in the left and the right side are all relaxed. So, what happens in this joint diastole stage? All the chambers are in the relaxed state. Blood is flowing into the right and the left atrium. So, this is deoxygenated blood coming from the systemic circulation as well as oxygenated blood coming from the lungs via the pulmonary veins as well as the superior and inferior vena cavas. So, this blood is flowing into the atrium which is in a relaxed state, and then we have the blood flowing, it is not remaining in the atrium because the valves are open. So, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves are open. So, the blood is then flowing from the atria into the ventricles, and the ventricles are also in a relaxed state. After this, what begins is known as the atrial systole. So, the atrial systole begins with the sinoatrial node which generates an action potential. Now, I told you there are some fibers that are spreading out throughout the surface of both atria that originate from the sinoatrial node. So, this conducts the electrical impulse across the entire musculature of the two atria which allows them to contract simultaneously. Okay. So, when the two will contract together, what this does is there was already some blood flowing from the atria into the ventricles passively, but now the contraction of the atria together will push the rest of the blood into the ventricles as well. So, this pushes about 30% more blood into the ventricles. Now, the next stage is called as the ventricular systole. Now, as you remember, the systole refers to the term which is contracted stage of the musculature of the heart. So, previously we talked about the atrial systole, now we are going to talk about the ventricular systole. So, after the atrial systole, there is the action potential is now reached the AV node. After going through the two atria, it has reached the AV node, and from the AV node, it then goes through the bundle of His and it spreads to the Purkinje fibers on either side, and the entire electrical potential is now making the two ventricles contract together. So, that has a very powerful effect, and at the same time what happens is the atria now start to relax, and because of this force that is generated in the two ventricles, it causes the valves, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves to snap shut. So, the ventricles are contracting, the valves between them are snapped shut. So, the blood cannot flow into the atria, back into the atria. Instead, they will go through the outflow tract. So, what is this outflow tract? Remember the aorta from the left ventricle and the pulmonary artery from the right ventricle. So, the blood will now flow out, and this happens only because the semilunar valves are open. Right. So, the increasing pressure will cause the semilunar valves to open up, and the blood will now gush out through the pulmonary artery as well as the aorta. One goes to the lungs and the other goes to the systemic circulation. Then comes the final stage, which is called as the ventricular diastole. So, the ventricular diastole happens when the ventricles will be in a relaxed state. So, now the ventricles will go through a stage of relaxation. What will happen is, before this begins, the semilunar valves will close, so that whatever blood has been pushed into the pulmonary artery and the aorta during the contraction of the ventricles cannot come back into the ventricles again. So, once they have gone out, they are out. So, now the ventricles will start to relax, preventing the backflow of blood into them, and the bicuspid and tricuspid valves are now again pushed open, by the blood which is again coming into the atria. So, before this the ventricular systole was coinciding with the atrial diastole. So, the atrial diastole was happening at the same time. So, the atria were relaxing and blood was flowing in, but while the ventricles were contracting there was no communication between the atria and the ventricles. Hence, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves were closed. So, no blood could come from the atria into the ventricles. Only when the ventricles become relaxed can this happen. So, then the bicuspid and tricuspid valves will open and blood will now come back into the ventricles through the from the atrium, and they are both now in the relaxed state. So, this goes back to the very first step where we started, and the cycle is complete with the joint diastole taking place, where both the atria and the ventricles are in a relaxed state, and this will be followed by another cycle which will be triggered by the sinoatrial node, which will generate another action potential. So, this whole thing, the step starting with the joint diastole to the atrial systole, then to the ventricular systole and the ventricular diastole, is called as the cardiac cycle. So, this is what is written here. This sequential event in the heart, which is cyclically repeated, is called as the cardiac cycle, and it consists of systole and diastole of both the atria and the ventricles. The only thing that you need to remember here, which is not obvious, is that the atrial diastole coincides or overlaps largely with the ventricular systole. Now, let us talk about another term, which is called as the cardiac output. So, what do we mean by the cardiac output? So, the cardiac output is defined as the volume of blood that is pumped out by each ventricle in every minute. Okay. So, how do we get to know what is this volume of blood that is pumped out by the ventricle every minute? We can calculate it, but for that calculation we have to know certain other facts. So, what are the other facts? So, I will introduce you to another term which is called as the stroke volume. What is the stroke volume? The term itself is kind of self-explanatory. Every beat of the heart is called as a stroke. So, a single stroke of the ventricles, how much blood is coming out of each ventricle is known as the stroke volume. Okay. So, the volume of blood pumped out of each ventricle with each heartbeat. So, what is that volume? It is about 70 ml. Now, after this, how do we actually come to know the cardiac output? But we have to know the number of heartbeats in a minute, which I already told you before. The number of heartbeats is about 72. Now, you should be able to tell me how we can get to the cardiac output. The way we get to the cardiac output is by multiplying these two values, which will give us the cardiac output as nearly 5 liters or 5000 ml. So, this is the volume of blood that is pumped out by each ventricle every minute. Knowing these values is important because when there is a malfunction of the heart or there is a problem with the circulatory system, there is a change in the cardiac output, and the change in the cardiac output will have a profound effect on the rest of the body, because this is where the oxygenated blood supply is coming from. So, if there is a decrease in the cardiac output, this will affect the oxygenation of all the tissues in the body, and this will have a long lasting and profound effect in the whole body. Now, let us talk about another feature of the heart, which all of you are probably familiar with. Since you were a little child, you have probably heard of this, the heart sounds. People have told you that you hear a lub and a dub sound. So, what does this lub and the dub mean? So, there are two sounds of the heart. The first heart sound is called as the lub sound, and the second heart sound is called as the dub sound. So, what are these associated with? What are we actually hearing? So, what we are hearing is the closing of the valves. So, when you hear the closing of the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves, when do they close? When the beginning of the contraction of the ventricles is happening. So, they close at that time. So, that is the first heart sound, and it is called a lub. And the second heart sound is associated with the closing of the semilunar valves. When the blood has been pumped out of the ventricles into the aorta and the pulmonary artery, the valves will shut, the semilunar valves. So, this produces a dub sound. So, now you know the answer to the question, what is the lub and the dub sound that you have been hearing in your heart. Now, we are going to move on and talk about another aspect of the heart function, that is how to monitor the functioning of the heart. This is done through what is called as an electrocardiogram or ECG. So, electrocardiogram is something that most of you might be familiar with. You must have watched television shows or movies in which you have watched a person who is hooked up to a machine and his heart activity is being monitored, and on a screen you can see the heartbeat of the person. So, the machine that actually does this is called as the electrocardiograph. So, this electrocardiograph machine is measuring the electrical activity of the heart, and this is represented graphically, and this is throughout the cardiac cycle this monitoring happens, and this whole output of the electrocardiograph machine is called as the ECG or electrocardiogram. Now, how is this done? So, when this is done, a patient is connected up to a machine, the electrocardiograph, and there are 3 electrical leads, one to each wrist and one to the left ankle, and this is used to monitor the electrical activity of the heart. Now, you may wonder why the electrodes are hooked up to the wrist or the ankle. Although the electrical activity is taking place within the heart, some of this electrical activity comes up to the surface of the skin and it can be detected there. And therefore, if you put electrodes at the wrist or the ankle, you can monitor the electrical activity of the heart, and this is a very good non-invasive way of understanding how the heart is functioning. Now, let us move on and look at what is this electrocardiogram look like. So, this is a graphical representation of that electrocardiogram, and it has various parts. So, when a patient goes to the doctor, you might remember that this ECG machine, it gives an output which is like a tape, and on this tape there is a graph paper on which there is a representation of the electrical activity of the heart, and this is what is shown exactly here. Now, what are the different parts of this graph? So, there are many peaks in this graph, as you noticed, and each peak in the ECG is identified with a letter from the alphabet ranging from P to T that corresponds to specific electrical activity or events that are happening in the heart, which I will explain subsequently. So, as you see, this little peak is called the P, then there is this activity which is a high peak, a dip, and then a high peak, and then again a dip. This is called as the QRS complex, and then with a gap there is another peak which is called the T. So, from the P up to the T is one cardiac cycle, and then you begin with another P for the next heartbeat. So, what does this represent? The P wave represents the electrical excitation or depolarization of the atria. Now, why is it called depolarization? So, normally there is a membrane potential associated with all cells. Every cell has a membrane, and because ions are distributed unevenly across this membrane, there is a net negative charge more inside the cell as opposed to the exterior of the cell. So, this is true for the heart muscle as well as for every other cell. But the difference between all other cells and the heart muscle or other muscles and the nerves are that they can change this membrane potential. So, the membrane potential can be changed by opening up certain channels within the membrane, which allows the flow of ions in and out of the cell, and this can change the distribution of ions on either side of the membrane and hence change the membrane potential. So, in this way the electrical activity can be conducted throughout the surface of the cell. So, now as you said, as I told you before, the heart muscle had these specialized tissues which are called as the nodes, the sinoatrial node and the AV node. So, these nodal tissues are connected by long fibers. So, this electrical membrane potential change that is happening at the node travels across the fiber and is conducted right from the sinoatrial node to the AV node to the bundle of His and to the Purkinje fibers. Now, the P wave represents the electrical excitation which is called depolarization. So, there was net negative charge inside the membrane and more positive charge outside the membrane. So, when depolarization happens, positively charged ions are moving into the cell. So, the membrane now becomes more positive inside than it was before. So, this is called as depolarization. So, this depolarization happens during an action potential. So, the SA node is firing an action potential. So, this depolarization is happening and this can be detected by placing an electrode on the surface of the skin, as I told you, and when this is happening in the atria, this is called as the P wave. So, you see it as this little blip on the ECG. Then comes the QRX complex. So, the QRX complex is much more stronger because it represents the depolarization of the ventricles, which is much more stronger than that of the atria. So, therefore, you see a large blip on the ECG, which is known as the QRS complex. Then the contraction starts of the ventricles shortly after the Q, which marks the beginning of the systolic phase of the heart muscle. Lastly, the T wave, which is the return of the ventricles from excitation to normal state, which is called as repolarization. So, here you see a small blip which represents the end of the systole, which ends the cardiac cycle, and the next heartbeat begins with the P wave once again. Now, let us talk about the circulatory system. So far we have learnt about the heart, how many chambers it has, what are the mechanism of blood flow into the heart, how it conducts this blood from the heart to the different tissues, how the blood is transferred between the different chambers of the heart, and also how the heart is electrically active, and the muscles of the heart in the atria and the ventricle, how they can contract simultaneously yet in a sequential manner to direct the flow of blood in a particular direction. And we have also learned about the ECG, which allows us to actually get a virtual view of the electrical activity of the heart and what is taking place without actually going inside. So, then we want to move on and now talk about this circulation of the entire system in the body. So, the circulation, as you know, can be divided into humans into two kinds of circulation, the pulmonary circulation and the systemic circulation. So, this diagram itself will tell you what these two systems are. So, you see here the first part is the pulmonary circulation and the second part is the systemic circulation. So, what are the characteristics of the pulmonary and systemic circulation? So, as I told you, the deoxygenated blood needs to get oxygenated and it has to therefore leave the heart through the pulmonary artery, go into the lungs where there are many branches of the blood vessels. These are the capillaries, and this increases the surface area in the lungs where the air that you breathe in, which contains oxygen, comes in contact, close contact with the capillaries, and the gaseous oxygen exchange takes place in the lung. There the blood becomes oxygenated. So, the color of that is represented here. So, deoxygenated blood is always shown as purple in color and oxygenated blood is shown as red in color. So, here the oxygenated blood will now go back into the heart to the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle it enters into the systemic circulation. So, this oxygenated blood will go out through the aorta, which is a large blood vessel, and this large blood vessel then goes to make several branches and it goes to different body parts where it supplies the oxygenated blood to all the tissues, and here the exchange of gases will again take place through capillaries. So, in this diagram you can see that how these blood vessels look like. So, you have large blood vessels which are called as arteries and veins. So, these have a layer of endothelial cells and then they have musculature around them. So, the smooth muscles will contract and regulate the flow of blood in this pipe, which is called as a blood vessel. So, the arteries carry oxygenated blood to tissues, then they form smaller branches which are called arterioles. when they enter a particular organ, and they form even smaller branches which are called as capillaries. These only have a single layer of cells in their walls which are known as endothelial cells, and this facilitates the exchange of gases and nutrients across these walls. Now, the single cell walled capillaries will then coalesce together and form venules, and then they will form veins, and these veins will carry the blood back through the vena cava into the right side of the heart once again. So, now you have understood what the double circulation is. Now, let us talk about the systemic circulation in a little bit more detail. So, as I said, the systemic circulation provides nutrients, oxygen and other essential substance to the tissues, and it also takes away carbon dioxide and harmful substances that are produced due to the metabolism or metabolic pathways that are active in these tissues, which need to be removed and eliminated. There are two different sub parts of the circulation, the systemic circulation, which I will very briefly tell you about. One is called the hepatic portal system. So, what does this comprise of? This comprises of a network of blood vessels that originate from the gut tube. So, if this is your intestine, the function of the intestine is the passage of food, and as food is passing through, it is being digested and broken down into smaller and smaller components, and most of it is then getting absorbed into the walls of the intestine, and thereby it is also getting into the blood vessels which are present around the intestine. So, when the food gets into the blood vessels, these blood vessels will collect together and they go to the liver. So, this is the hepatic portal system. So, the nutrients that get into the blood circulation before they go back to the heart to be circulated once again to all the tissues, they need to be cleaned up in the liver. So, certain modifications need to be made, which is the function of this hepatic portal system in the liver, and this is the function it performs. Now, other than this, there is another system which is very important and which is directly related to the heart, and this is called as the coronary system. So, there is a branch of the aorta which supplies direct oxygenated blood to the heart muscle itself. You imagine the heart muscle has to undergo contractions throughout the entire period of a human being's life, and to do that it will need a constant supply of oxygen. Therefore, the coronary artery system makes many branches which surrounds the muscles of the heart and supplies oxygen and nutrients to the heart muscle so that it can continue to function. Now, let us talk about the regulation of cardiac activity. How is this activity regulated? So, you have heard of the nodal tissues which I mentioned before, the SA node and the AV node. They are regulated intrinsically, meaning they have an intrinsic rhythm of electrical activity which continues throughout the life of the individual. So, these are the tissues regulating cardiac activity. Then there is external regulation of the heartbeat as well. So, while it has some internal mechanism to regulate the heartbeat, there is an external mechanism which is taking place from this part of the brain which is known as the medulla. So, this medulla has a system which monitors cardiac function through a branch of the nervous system called as the autonomic nervous system. So, it has two branches, the sympathetic nerves and the parasympathetic nerves. The sympathetic part of the system will actually increase the rate of heartbeat and increase the strength of contraction of the heart muscles when needed, when you need to supply more blood, when you are running, when you are performing some strenuous activities, then the sympathetic system can increase the heartbeat and increase the blood flow out of the heart. The opposite is needed when you do not want to pump out too much blood into the system to the muscles. So, here the parasympathetic system will actually lower the heartbeat and decrease the output coming out of the cardiac system. In addition to this, there is a gland which is present on the kidney which is called as the adrenal gland, and it secretes certain hormones which can also increase the outflow of blood from the heart. So, together all this sympathetic, parasympathetic and adrenal medullary systems can regulate the heartbeat. Now, let us talk very briefly about certain disorders of the circulatory system. So, first let us talk about high blood pressure. So, all of you have heard of this, probably some people in your family or in your friends have known to suffer from this, which is the hypertension. So, what is hypertension? Hypertension is the term used for blood pressure that is higher than the normal, which is about 120/80. So, 120 refers to the systolic blood pressure, which is during the contraction of the ventricles, and 80 is during the relaxation phase, which is diastole. So, if there is consistently blood pressure higher than 120 by 80, about a value of 140 by 90, then that person is reported to have hypertension. So, what is the problem? Because of this increased blood pressure, it can lead to lot of diseases such as heart disease and also affect the function of the organs like the brain and the kidney. Then another disease that you might be familiar with is called as the coronary artery disease. Now, I talked to you about the coronary vasculature that supplies blood directly to the heart muscle. Now, what happens in coronary artery disease is that there is a blockage in this blood vessel. So, very often because of our lifestyle, because of taking in too much fat or other substances in your diet, there is a deposit of calcium, fat, cholesterol and various fibrous tissues that will actually block the blood vessel. So, it forms like a plaque on the inside of the blood vessel, and if this grows enough, then your blood vessel can be blocked. And if this thing happens to the coronary artery, you can imagine how that will affect your heart. So, your heart muscle will suddenly stop receiving oxygen and nutrients in one particular region wherever the block has happened, and that will lead to a very severe disorder which is known as heart attack or myocardial infarction. Now, the other disorders that you might have heard of in the circulatory system are known as angina or heart pain. This is called angina pectoris. It is a acute system of chest pain that appears when there is not enough oxygen supply reaching the heart muscle. So, this can happen to anybody at any age, but usually happens in the elderly patient and in middle aged patients, and it occurs due to the occlusion of blood flow, the cause of which can be the previous one that I talked about, the coronary artery disease. And lastly, I will talk about heart failure. Heart failure means a state when the heart is not able to pump out enough blood to supply oxygen to the entire body. So, it does not meet the needs of the body. It is sometimes called as congestive heart failure because the lungs become congested with blood, and heart failure needs to be distinguished however from heart attack, which I referred to before. Heart attack is when there is a lack of blood supply due to a block in a coronary artery and the particular muscle in the heart fails to contract. But heart failure is a systemic failure of the entire heart to pump out blood, and it can happen due to various reasons. So, with this I am going to end today's lecture. Before I leave you, I will leave you with certain questions, the answers to which we will talk about in the beginning of the next lecture that I will deliver. So, the first question is, what are the primary differences between the circulation in amphibians and humans? Well, if you remember in the first part of the lecture, I said the amphibians have a 3-chambered heart. What does a 3-chambered heart mean? It means that there is 2 atria and 1 ventricle. And what happens in this case is that the blood which is oxygenated as well as deoxygenated is coming into the right and the left atrium, but from there it is passing into the single ventricle. And because there is a single ventricle, there is a mixing of the blood between the oxygenated and the deoxygenated form. So, as a result, whatever is pumped out of the ventricle and is going into the circulation, part of it is going to the lung to get oxygenated, and the rest of it is going down into the rest of the circulation to the other tissues to supply oxygen to these tissues. So, the primary difference between the heart or the circulatory system of an amphibian and a human is this mixing of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood which takes place. So, it is only a partial double circulation, unlike the humans where there is a chambered heart, 4-chambered heart where the ventricles are separate. So, there is no mixing of the deoxygenated and oxygenated blood, and only oxygenated blood is supplied to all of the tissues. Okay. So, now let us look at the second question. Okay, the second question pertains to the electrical activity of the heart, which is originating in the SA node or the SAN. Now, the question is, there is a delay in the passage of this action potential from the SA node to the bundle of His. Now, if you remember, Where is the SA node? SA node is located in the atria, the right atrium, and the bundle of His is located in the intraventricular septum. So, this is the pathway through which the electrical activity which originates in the atrium is conducted into the ventricles. Now, there is a delay between these two processes. Now, why is the delay is the question. The reason that the delay is there is because you do not want the ventricles to contract simultaneously with the atria, because the blood is first coming into the atria and you want the atria to first contract and push this blood into the ventricle, and only then the ventricle should contract and push out this blood from the heart to the either to the lungs or to the systemic circulation. Now, in order for this to happen one after the other, there needs to be a delay between the conduction of the electrical activity from the atrium to the ventricle, and hence there is a delay. So, the third question is at the end of the diastolic volume is 110 to 120 ml. This is called the end diastolic volume, and the end systolic volume, which is the volume of blood in the heart at the end of systole, is about 40 to 50 ml. Then what would be the stroke output volume? So, if you remember, I discussed in the beginning of the lecture what is the stroke output volume, that is the amount of blood pumped out by the ventricles every heartbeat. Okay. So, this can be calculated by subtracting the end systolic volume from the end diastolic volume. Now, why do we have to do that? Because at the end of systole you have actually pumped out the blood, and at the end of diastole you are ready to pump out the blood. So, what was there at the end of diastole is the total volume, which is 110 to 120. From that you are going to subtract what is left at the end of systole, meaning after pumping out what is left. So, that is 40 to 50 ml. Now, if you subtract this comes out to be around 70 ml, which is the stroke output volume. So, now you understand how you can calculate the stroke output volume of the heart. Okay. The fourth question is, why do we hear two heart sounds? So, as I mentioned before in the lecture, there is a typical heart sound. If you have ever listened to your heart, you can hear this lub and the dub. So, why do we hear two heart sounds? The reason is because of the closing of the valves. So, there are two sets of valves in the heart. Those that are between the atria and the ventricle, they are called the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves, and those that are at the mouths of the big blood vessels that take the blood out of the ventricles, which is the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So, these are called the semilunar valves. So, when these snap shut, that is the point where the heart sound is produced, because the bicuspid and tricuspid valves are larger. So, when they are first shut, then you hear the first heart sound, which is a lub, and then you hear the milder sound, which is a higher pitch of the semilunar valves closing, which is the dub. So, this makes the two heart sounds, the lub and the dub. Now, you may ask, why do not we hear the opening of the valves? Because the opening of the valves does not make any sound, therefore, we do not hear those. Then the question is, why is the sinoatrial node called the pacemaker of the heart? So, I explained to you before, sinoatrial node is a part of the atrium, and this is where all the electrical activity of the heart originates. So, this is a very special tissue. Although it is a part of the heart muscle, it does not have any muscle fibers which make it contract. It is only able to conduct electrical impulses. So, it can conduct electrical impulses which spread throughout the heart, and this SA node has its intrinsic electrical activity, because of which it can generate action potentials at a certain rate. Now, there are other regions of the heart, for example, the AV node as well as the Purkinje fibers, which also have their inherent electrical activity, meaning they can also generate action potentials at a certain rate. However, the rate of generation of action potentials of the SA node is much faster. So, it is about 70 to 80 times a minute. So, this is why it supersedes whatever electrical activity is present in the other regions of the heart, for example, the AV node or the Purkinje fiber. So, since the electrical action potential firing rate is coming from the SA node, even before the next one from the intrinsic activity of the AV node fires, it is superseded by the one coming from the SA node. So, the SA node decides the pace at which there will be electrical impulses fired in the heart, and this is why it is called the pacemaker of the heart, because it sets the pace or the rate of beating of the heart. Now, we will talk about the sixth question. What could be the relationship between coronary artery disease and a heart attack? So, if you remember in the last part of the lecture where I was talking about diseases of the circulatory system, I explained that there is something called coronary artery disease. The reason is that the heart muscle itself has to be supplied with oxygen. You can imagine it is constantly beating, so it needs a constant supply of oxygen for this muscle to contract, and this is supplied by what are known as coronary arteries, which are branches of the aorta which supply oxygenated blood to the heart muscle. Now, if there is a block in this coronary artery because of our lifestyle and because of the kind of diet we are taking, very often we get very high levels of circulating fat in our blood, and the fat in the blood can accumulate and form a blockage within these arteries. And if it happens to be a coronary artery, then you can block the blood supply to a particular region of the heart muscle. And what will this do? This will lead to what is known as coronary artery disease. Now, what is the result of this? The result of this is that that area of the heart muscle is not getting oxygen and not getting nutrients. So, it cannot contract, and because of which your heart beat or your contraction of your heart will all go awry, right. So, it will not be able to contract properly, and that is when you get a heart attack. So, heart attack is often the reason for getting a heart attack is actually coronary artery disease, one of the reasons. So, this is why this is the relationship between coronary artery disease and a heart attack. The last question is, why can't we see the repolarization of the atria in the ECG? So, as I described the graph in the ECG to you, there are different parts in that. There was the P, the QRS and the T. So, the P represent the depolarization of the atria, and the QRS complex represented the depolarization of the ventricles. Now, after the depolarization of the atria, there should be a repolarization of the atria. We can see the repolarization of the ventricles, which is the T wave. Then why can't we see the repolarization of the atria in the ECG? The reason is that it is coinciding with the depolarization of the ventricles, and because the ventricular depolarization is such a large electrical activity, so the QRX complex actually overshadows the little T wave, which would be the atrial T wave. So, you cannot see the atrial T wave on the ECG for that reason. So, with this I am going to end this lecture. Thank you very much.